The private dining room on the 52nd floor went silent when Vivian Blackwood reached for her assistant a second time. Nobody stood. Nobody dared look straight at the woman who controlled billions of dollars and the future of nearly 10,000 employees. Nobody except me. I am the single father in the old charcoal coat who pushed back the chair at the far end of the table. She looked at me the way you look at a caterer who wandered into the wrong room. I said 4 words, cold enough to freeze the air, touch her again. Then, finally, she recognized me. If you enjoy stories where arrogance pays the full price, subscribe to the channel now and watch what Vivian Blackwood realizes next. 3 hours earlier, I walked into the Blackwood Meridian Tower wearing a suit I had owned for 11 years, carrying a leather briefcase with a cracked handle and a small stain near the clasp where my daughter had once spilled apple juice. No car service waited at the curb and no assistant walked half a step behind. The receptionist studied my badge, then my shoes, then pointed me toward the service elevator because she assumed I belonged to the contractor crew refitting the ventilation on floor 30. I did not correct her. People build a story about you in 4 seconds, and arguing only makes them defend it. So I rode the freight elevator up with 2 men carrying copper wire, and one offered me half a granola bar, and I took it because I had skipped breakfast getting my daughter to school. I was there because Graham Sterling had called me at 9 o'clock the previous evening and asked me, in the careful voice of a man who suspects his own building, whether I still remembered how to read a deal that had been dressed up for company. Blackwood Meridian was preparing to acquire a regional freight operation called Alder Peak Logistics for $2.4 billion, and the chief executive wanted the board to approve it that same night, over dinner, with the champagne already chilling. Graham had listed me on the attendance sheet under 4 words that meant almost nothing: independent operations consultant. He did that on purpose. He wanted me in the room before anyone decided what I was, because the moment a company knows an auditor has arrived, the company starts performing. The important thing, the thing that shaped every hour that followed, was that Vivian Blackwood did not know who I was. She had built her career on the assumption that anyone worth fearing arrived, announced. So when she passed me in the 28th floor corridor and her eyes dropped to the plain steel watch on my wrist, she turned to the executive walking beside her and asked, loudly enough that 3 other people heard it, whether Sterling was bringing freelancers into board meetings now. She said the word freelancer, the way some people say the word infection. I heard every syllable, and I felt the small familiar heat behind my ribs that I have spent years learning to leave unattended. It seems so, I said. That was all. I have found that calm bothers a certain kind of powerful person far more than argument does, because argument gives them something to win. Vivian's jaw tightened. She was 42 years old, 3rd generation of a financial family that had been lending money since the 1890s, and she had spent her entire adult life inside rooms that arranged themselves around her mood. My flat, unbothered answer did not arrange itself around anything. She walked on, heels striking the marble like a metronome, set slightly too fast, and I understood something about her before we had exchanged 12 words. She did not want obedience. She wanted the visible act of obedience. There is a difference, and the difference is where cruelty lives. While the executives filed into the preliminary session, I watched her assistant. Nora Whitaker was 31, sharp-eyed, competent in the way that only exhausted people are, and she was carrying 3 binders and a tablet while trying to keep her hands from shaking. She had that specific hollow look I recognized from the last year of my own marriage, the look of a person doing everything right inside a situation that has already been rigged against them. When she handed Vivian a binder, Vivian opened it, glanced at the header, and closed it again with a small dry sound. "This is the second version," Vivian said. "Perhaps this job has finally exceeded your capabilities." She said it in front of 9 people. 2 of them looked at the ceiling. One studied his phone with tremendous interest. Nobody spoke for Nora, and that silence told me more about Blackwood Meridian than any balance sheet could have. I began to understand that whatever was wrong with this company was not living in the numbers. The numbers were only where it had left its footprints. Nora gathered the binder back, apologized twice for something that was not her fault, and turned toward the door. And as she passed me, a folder slipped from the stack under her arm and fanned open against the carpet. I crouched to gather the pages. I did not intend to read them, but one line sat at the top of the 3rd sheet in bold black type, and it went into me like a splinter. Projected loss exposure, $186,400,000. I handed the folder back and said nothing. Nora's eyes met mine for less than a second, and in that second I saw that she knew exactly what I had just read, and that she was terrified, and that some small, starved part of her was relieved that another human being had finally seen it. Then she was gone down the corridor. I stood there in the hallway of a company worth $30 billion, holding my cracked briefcase, and I ran that figure against every page of the board packet Graham had sent me the night before. $186,400,000. It appeared nowhere. Not in the summary, not in the appendices, not in the risk narrative, not in a single footnote of a document the directors were expected to vote on before dessert. The preliminary session began at 2 o'clock, and Vivian presented Alder Peak Logistics the way a museum presents its best painting. She stood at the head of a table of black walnut, in front of a window with the whole gray river laid out behind her, and she called the acquisition the most consequential expansion Blackwood Meridian would make in a decade. She spoke without notes. She was, I will admit this freely, extraordinarily good at it. She had the trick of making a forecast sound like a memory, as though the profits had already happened, and the vote were merely a formality of paperwork. The directors nodded along in the small rhythmic way that people nod when they have decided to agree before they arrived. I did not nod. When she asked, with a thin performance of graciousness, whether the room had questions, I asked 3. Why had Alder Peak's insurance costs risen 41% in 18 months when its fleet had not grown? Why did 3 of its 5 largest customer contracts contain cancellation clauses that triggered on a change of ownership? And why was an exposure of $186,400,000 absent from every page the board had been given? The room changed temperature. I have sat in perhaps 200 rooms like that one over the course of my working life, and there is a particular sound that happens when a question lands in a place someone had sealed shut, a sound made of chairs shifting and pens being set down very carefully. Elliot Crane, the chief financial officer, went absolutely still. Marianne Caldwell, the independent director, turned toward me slowly, like someone hearing a noise in a house she thought was empty. Vivian did not answer me at all. She looked at Nora, standing against the wall by the credenza, and her voice came out flat as a blade laid on a table. Where did he get that number? Nora said she had provided nothing. She said it steadily, which took more courage than anyone in that room was equipped to notice. Vivian held her gaze 3 seconds longer than was necessary, filing it away, and then turned to me with a smile that had no warmth anywhere in it. She told the room that men in my position frequently look at 2 or 3 spreadsheets and mistake that for understanding how an enterprise breathes. She said consultants collect anomalies the way children collect stones, and that the difference between an anomaly and a risk is judgment, and that judgment is what her family had been accumulating for a century and a quarter, while people like me billed by the hour. I did not argue with her. Arguing would have handed her the room. An empire can still go bankrupt, I said, because of one small line in a spreadsheet. 2 directors looked at each other. That was all I wanted. Vivian heard it, and she understood that she had just lost 4 inches of ground in front of people whose opinions determined her authority, and she did what her instincts had always rewarded. She informed me, in the tone one uses with a junior clerk, that I should not speak again unless directly addressed. After the session, she instructed Nora, loudly enough for me to hear from 20 feet, to move me from the guest dining allocation to the support staff cafeteria on floor 11, because the guest count had been miscalculated. It had not been miscalculated. Nora came to tell me with visible misery, apologizing for a decision she had no part in. "It's all right," I told her. "I can eat anywhere." I meant it, and I think that was the first moment she began to consider that I might not be exactly what my coat suggested. Status has never had much grip on me. It had grip on me once, in my early 30s, when I owned a firm and a good watch and a view of a harbor, and then my wife got sick, and I discovered in about 11 weeks how many of those things could keep a person company at 2 in the morning in a hospital corridor. After that, the seating chart at a corporate dinner stopped being able to reach me. What can still reach me is watching a person get crushed in public, while everyone with the power to stop it decides to study the tablecloth. Nora found me by the window at the end of the 11th floor corridor 40 minutes later. She stood beside me and looked out at the river for a while before she said anything, and then she told me quietly that the report I had glimpsed was an internal version, version 4. She said there was a version 5, prepared for the board, and that the difference between them was $186,400,000 and about 9 pages of supplier obligations. She said the instruction not to circulate version 4 had come from the executive office directly, and that she had been the one told to make the substitution, and that she had done it, and that she had not slept properly in 9 days. "Do you still have the original?" I asked. She did not answer. She looked at the glass, and her hands were folded so tightly the knuckles had gone white, and that silence was the whole answer, and both of us knew it. I told her not to tell me anything else in a hallway. I told her that whatever she was holding, she should not carry it alone for even one more day, and that there were structures designed for exactly her situation, and that I could explain them to her when we were somewhere with a door. She nodded once, quickly, the way people nod when they are afraid that agreeing out loud will make it real. Then I glanced past her shoulder toward the far end of the corridor. Vivian Blackwood was standing there perfectly still, watching both of us. She had Nora in her office within 11 minutes. I know because I was in the small conference room next door reviewing supplier schedules, and the wall between those rooms is glass with an acoustic seal that engineering never quite finished. I heard most of it, and what I heard has stayed with me, because there was not one raised voice in the entire exchange. Vivian did not need to raise her voice. She had something far more efficient than volume, and she used it with the unhurried precision of a surgeon who has performed the same procedure 400 times. She reminded Nora that her employment agreement contained a confidentiality provision with a clause about proprietary financial materials. She reminded her that finance is a very small industry, smaller than people imagine, and that a single measured remark from a Blackwood at a single dinner could ensure that Nora never again held a comparable position anywhere between here and the coast. She reminded her that the apartment on Fenwick Street, the one Nora had lived in for 4 years, the one within walking distance of her mother's care facility, was corporate housing, and that corporate housing follows employment. She let each of those facts sit in the air by itself, unhurried, giving them room to grow. And then she said the sentence I have not been able to forget. "Do not confuse my kindness with permission to betray me." Nora signed nothing that afternoon, but she was made to say out loud that the discrepancy between the 2 report versions had been an administrative error on her part. She said it in a voice I could barely hear. I was standing in the corridor when the door opened, and Vivienne came out and saw me there, and she understood at once approximately how much I had heard, and she was not remotely concerned about it. "Don't try to play the hero here, Mr. Rowan," she said. "I haven't done anything," I said. She laughed, one short exhalation, and it was almost affectionate in its contempt. "Precisely, and that is how you keep your contract." That was a deeper cut than the freelancer remark, and she knew it. She had decided I was a man who needed money, and in her arithmetic, a man who needs money is a man whose spine has a price attached to it. She had apparently asked human resources for whatever basic file existed on me, because she added, adjusting the cuff of her jacket, that she understood I was raising a child by myself. She said it with the mildest possible inflection, which is how the most dangerous things are usually said. She told me I had a family to feed, and that she would advise me to remember that before I decided to make any of this my problem. Something in me went cold then, not angry. I passed through angry years ago and came out the other side into something quieter and considerably more durable. My daughter is 8 years old. She has her mother's laugh and a deep and unreasonable loyalty to a stuffed elephant with one ear. When Vivienne Blackwood reached for her as a lever, she stopped being a difficult executive and became something I understood completely. My family, I said, is exactly how I know when someone is using power the wrong way. She left. I stood in the corridor and let my pulse come down. Nora came out a few minutes later with her makeup carefully repaired and her hands not quite steady, and she told me the rest of it, or the part of it she knew. Alder Peak Logistics was carrying a series of undisclosed financial obligations across its supplier network. Deferred maintenance liabilities, a pension shortfall in its northern division, and 2 settlement agreements sealed under confidentiality. Aggregated exposure could exceed $400 million within 30 months of closing. Vivienne knew. Nora had watched her read the analysis in March and set it down and say nothing at all. And still she wanted the transaction completed, urgently, before the quarter closed. Why, though? That was the piece Nora could not supply. A chief executive who buys a broken company destroys her own record, and Vivienne Blackwood was many things, but she was not careless about her record, which meant the transaction was not the point. The transaction was the vehicle. I walked to the stairwell where the reception is poor and nobody lingers, and I made one phone call. "Graham," I said, "don't hold the vote tonight." There were several seconds of silence on the other end, long enough that I could hear the faint sound of his office clock. Then, the chairman of Blackwood Meridian said, very quietly, "You found it then?" Dinner was at 7, in the private dining room on the 52nd floor, and Vivienne had arranged it as a coronation. 22 people, 6 directors, 4 senior executives, 11 investors of consequence, and me. There were white orchids down the center of the table, and a menu printed on heavy card, and a view that made the city look like something owned rather than lived in. She had planned to hold the vote between the second course and the dessert, when everyone was warm and pleased and disinclined to be the one person who complicates a beautiful evening. I have seen that technique used at least a dozen times. It works far more often than it should. She noticed me as the room was settling, and she made a small performance out of it, pausing with her wine glass halfway up, letting the conversation die down first. "You're still here?" she asked. "Chairman Sterling requested it," I said. Graham is occasionally too polite with people who don't know their place. Several people heard that. 2 of them winced. Not one of them said a word, and I want to be honest about what that silence is, because it is the actual subject of this whole story. Those were not weak people. They ran divisions and funds and factories. But every one of them had done the same rapid private calculation. The cost of speaking is mine, and the cost of silence is hers. That arithmetic is how a room of accomplished adults becomes furniture. Nora worked through the dinner. She should not have been working at all. But she moved along the table distributing the final agreement package, 1 folder at each place setting, her face composed and her eyes going nowhere near her employer. Then Vivienne asked her for the execution copy and, with it for her initials on the transmittal certification, the single page confirming that all appendices had been fully reviewed by the board. Nora set the folder down. She did not pick up the pen. She said clearly that she could not certify that, because the appendices had not been provided to the board. I watched Vivienne's face do something I had only seen once before, 7 years earlier, in a conference room 11 floors below us. It did not become furious, it became empty. Fury is a human weather. What crossed her features was closer to the expression of a machine encountering an obstruction it had not been designed to expect. "Initial it," she said. Nora said no a second time. Her voice cracked in the middle of the word, and she said it anyway, and I want that recorded, because everything that happened afterward was built on a 31-year-old woman with a mother in a care facility and an apartment she would lose, saying one syllable into a room of 22 silent people. Vivienne stood. She crossed the 2 steps between them and took the folder out of Nora's hands hard enough that the pages came loose and went across the floor in a white spill. Then she caught Nora's wrist and pulled her back toward the table, and she leaned in, and she said softly, but not so softly that the 4 nearest guests could pretend otherwise, "You work for me." Nora asked her to let go. Vivienne did not let go. I stood up. My chair made almost no sound on the carpet. I did not shout. There were $400,000 of orchids and crystal between us, and I spoke across all of it at a completely ordinary volume, because I had known for 6 hours exactly what I was holding, and a man who knows what he is holding has no reason to be loud. "Touch her again." Vivienne turned. Her fingers opened, and Nora's wrist came free, and Nora stepped back against the credenza with both hands pressed flat behind her. And then all of that contained pressure, having lost its original target, came around and found me. "Did you just threaten me?" she said. "No, I'm giving you a chance to stop." She laughed and walked toward me, and she came close, closer than the situation required, which is a habit of people who have never once been physically afraid of anyone. "Do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" "Yes." "Then you should know I can make certain you are never hired in this industry again." I looked at her for a few seconds. Down the table, Graham Sterling set his fork on the edge of his plate and folded his hands, and Marianne Caldwell turned fully in her chair, and Elliot Crane began, very slowly, to lose color. "You already tried that once," I said. Her smile stopped. I watched her actually look at my face for the first time in 7 years, not at the coat or the watch or the badge, at the face, and I saw her run it against some old file she had closed and archived and been assured was permanently shut. Her eyes moved down and found the small steel ring on my right hand, the one my wife had bought at a market in Vermont for $9, because I would not wear anything expensive. "Rowan," she whispered. "You remembered," I said. "Finally." 7 years ago, I was the managing principal of Rowan Strategic Recovery, a restructuring firm with 19 employees, no marketing department, and a reputation that got us into rooms that companies 4 times our size could not enter. We were hired when a business was 2 quarters from a fatal mistake, and the people running it were too invested to see it. In the spring of that year, Blackwood Meridian ran into a liquidity crisis in its industrial services division, and Graham Sterling, then a newer chairman, brought us in to determine whether the division could be saved or should be amputated. It could be saved. The problem was that when we traced 4 years of capital allocation, every significant decision led to the same office. Vivienne Blackwood was vice chair then, 35. Groomed with total certainty for the top of the building, she had pushed 3 acquisitions and 1 financing structure that together produced a debt profile that would not survive a single bad winter. It was not fraud. It was arrogance holding a signing authority, which is often more expensive. She came to my office alone on a Thursday evening, and asked me to restructure the report. Not falsify, she was careful about that. Restructure. Present the findings by division rather than by decision maker, which would have distributed the responsibility across 11 executives like water poured on sand. She explained that she was 3 years from the chief executive position and that this report, in its current shape, would cost her those 3 years. And she pointed out with perfect accuracy that Rowan Strategic did roughly 19% of its annual revenue with entities connected to her family. I filed the report as written. Within 5 weeks our contract was terminated, our final invoice was disputed for 8 months, and 4 prospective clients quietly stopped returning calls. I never proved she made those calls. I did not need to. But the report itself reached Graham Sterling's hands, and Graham did what chairmen are supposed to do exactly once or twice in a career, which is act on information that is inconvenient for everyone, including himself. The Industrial Services Division was restructured over 14 months. Blackwood Meridian avoided losses that our modeling put just under $1 billion. My name appeared nowhere in the record of it, because the settlement of our disputed invoice came with a confidentiality provision that I signed without reading twice, because by then my wife had been diagnosed and I had approximately no attention left for anything else. She died the following November. I sold my equity to a partner who deserved it, stopped flying, and started making school lunches. Vivian Blackwood believed I had evaporated, the way inconvenient people are supposed to. What she did not know was that for 6 years Graham Sterling had quietly continued to retain me for the one category of assignment where a client cannot trust its own reporting lines. In the dining room, Vivian recovered her footing faster than most people would have. That is a real ability, and I will not pretend otherwise. She straightened her jacket, and she said, with the composure back in place, that an accomplishment from 7 years ago did not make me a person with authority in this room. No, I said. I looked at the pages scattered on the floor between us, but the mandate the board gave me last week does. She stopped moving entirely. I told the room what I was. I had not been engaged by the operations group as a consultant, and Graham had listed me under that title deliberately, so that the company would behave normally around me for 1 full day. I had been retained by the Independent Audit Committee of Blackwood Meridian under a resolution passed 9 days earlier to conduct a complete pre-closing assessment of the Alder Peak Logistics transaction with unrestricted access to financial systems, supplier records, and the executive document repository. Elliot Crane spoke before Vivian did, which was the most useful mistake he made all evening. He said that could not be correct because such a mandate would grant access to reconciliation files that were sealed at the executive level. And he said the words reconciliation files in a way that told everyone at the table that he knew precisely which ones mattered. Vivian turned to the head of the table, Graham. Graham Sterling said nothing at all. He simply looked back at her with the patience of a 68-year-old man who had already made his decision in a smaller room earlier in the day. That silence confirmed everything, and every investor at that table understood it, and I watched the value of Vivian Blackwood's authority in that room drop to nearly nothing in the space of 4 seconds. And $186 million, I said, is not the biggest problem. I did not raise my voice for the rest of the evening. I want to be clear about the mechanics of what happened next, because it was not clever and it was not dramatic. It was 11 days of reading. First, Nora Whitaker had not leaked anything to me. I said that early, because Vivian's next move would require a traitor, and I intended to remove the option before she reached for it. I had found the discrepancy through 3 channels unconnected to the executive office. Alder Peak's commercial insurance premiums had risen 41%, which never happens without claims history or an underwriter repricing a risk profile, and that supplemental schedule was a public filing in 2 states. Its supplier remittances showed 41 payments over 19 months routed through one intermediary rather than directly. That intermediary sat inside a related entity called North Vale Holdings. North Vale Holdings held $412 million of Alder Peak's subordinated debt, acquired across the previous 2 years at what I estimated to be between 51 and 58 cents on the dollar. Alder Peak was, in plain language, a distressed asset, but under the acquisition structure Vivienne had put in front of the board, Blackwood Meridian would assume that subordinated debt at face value as a condition of closing. I asked the room a simple question: who owns North Vale Holdings? Vivienne said it was an unaffiliated private credit fund, and that its participation had been disclosed in the transaction summary as a third-party creditor, which was technically true, and which is the most dangerous kind of true. I put a single document on the table in front of Graham Sterling. It was a beneficial ownership chain, 4 layers deep, running from North Vale Holdings through 2 intermediate limited partnerships in Delaware and 1 in Wyoming, and terminating in a single instrument: the Blackwood Heritage Trust. Vivienne Blackwood was one of its 4 principal beneficiaries. Her entitlement was 31%. The room did not gasp. Real rooms never do. It went completely, absolutely quiet, and an investor near the window put down his glass with a small click that I could hear from 12 feet away. Because everybody at that table understood the arithmetic instantly. This was not a chief executive making an aggressive bet on a struggling company. This was a chief executive for a company she controlled to pay face value for debt that a trust she benefited from had purchased at half price. The $240 million of value the board had been told they were capturing was, in fact, the amount being transferred out of the shareholders and into the trust. She fought. I expected her to, and she did it well. She told the room that I had arrived with a 7-year-old grievance and had spent 9 days building a story around it, and that beneficial ownership chains through family trusts are ordinary, and that the Heritage Trust held positions in over 200 entities. She called me a failed man attempting to relive a period when he mattered. She said, and this was the sentence that lost her the last 2 directors, that I had sold my firm and vanished from the industry and come back in that old suit, and that I should not pretend any of this was ethics. She said it was bitterness. I did not answer any of that. Emotional arguments are quicksand. I asked one question instead. If I'm wrong, will you consent to opening the full North Vale file to the audit committee right now, tonight, every layer? She did not answer. The silence lasted perhaps 6 seconds, and it did more damage than 400 pages of analysis. Marianne Caldwell put her napkin on the table and moved formally that the vote be postponed pending independent verification. Elliot Crane objected immediately and forcefully, saying the transaction had a financing commitment that expired at the end of the month, and that delay would cost the company real money. I turned to him. You should agree with her. Why? He said. Because the second account is in your name. Elliot Crane sat down without appearing to decide to. $816,000 had moved, in 11 payments, from a North Vale advisory subsidiary to a consulting entity registered under his wife's maiden name. I had the wire references, and he knew it because he watched me recite them without looking at a page. He tried to leave. He got as far as pushing his chair back and reaching for his jacket, and Graham Sterling said, "Sit down, Elliot," in a voice like a door closing. Nobody blocked the exit. Nobody touched him. The doors stayed open all evening. But Elliot Crane was a financial officer with 23 years of career behind him, and he understood that walking out of that room at that moment would be the single most expensive step he ever took. So he sat, and he put his hands flat on the tablecloth, and he did not speak again for a very long time. Vivienne then did the thing I had been waiting for since the corridor that afternoon. She turned on Nora. She told the room that her executive assistant had been copying confidential transaction materials for weeks, that the document irregularities were Nora's doing, that Nora had access to the repository and a grievance about a performance review in January, and that this entire evening was the product of a disloyal employee feeding fragments to an outside party with a personal vendetta. She constructed it in about 40 seconds, and it was coherent, and if I had not been prepared for it, it would very likely have worked. That is what makes people like her dangerous. They do not lie clumsily. They build. Nora went white and could not get a full sentence out, which is what happens to honest people accused in front of 22 strangers. I did not let it stand. The document management system at Blackwood Meridian maintains a complete revision history with authenticated user attribution, retained for 7 years, and the audit committee's mandate had given me direct access to it on the second day. I had already pulled it. The substitution of version 4 with version 5, the removal of 9 appendix pages, the alteration of the risk narrative in the board summary, and the deletion of 2 exposure tables had all been executed from a single administrative credential belonging to the executive office. Timestamps between 11:41 at night and 12:19 in the morning on a Sunday. Nora Whitaker's credential did not possess write access to that repository. She could not have made those changes if she had wanted to. What she had done was transmit the substituted version when instructed, and then refuse twice, in a room full of people who would not help her, to certify a lie. "You cannot make her the reason for this," I said. "The record won't let you." Vivian declared that Nora was terminated as of that moment. "You can't," I said. "You think you decide that?" "No." Graham Sterling spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. "The audit committee decides that." He informed the room that Nora Whitaker had been designated a protected internal witness at 4:15 that afternoon, following my preliminary report of document irregularities under the company's own whistleblower framework and the statutory protections that sit above it. Her employment status, her compensation, and her corporate housing were frozen against adverse action for the duration of the investigation, and for 18 months afterward. Vivian Blackwood no longer possessed unilateral authority to dismiss her, reassign her, discipline her, or contact her regarding the matter. I had filed that at 3:50 in the afternoon. 25 minutes after I heard through a glass wall what a woman with a mother in a care facility was being told about her apartment. That is what the 4 words meant. I want that understood, because it is the only part of this story that I think actually matters. I am 39 years old, I have a bad shoulder, and I have never in my adult life won anything with my hands. When I stood up at that table, I was not being brave. Bravery is standing up when you have nothing. I had spent 9 days building a floor underneath Nora Whitaker, so that when she fell there would be something there. Standing up was simply the last step, and it was the easiest one. Vivian looked at me then, and I watched her arrive at it. She had spent an entire day believing she was managing a man who needed his invoice paid. What she saw now was someone who had known the shape of the whole board before he moved a piece, and who had let her humiliate him in a corridor and reroute him to a staff cafeteria and threaten his daughter, and had absorbed all of it, because absorbing it kept her comfortable for 6 more hours than she should have been. She had 1 card left, the oldest one in her family. She reminded Graham Sterling that the building had her name on it, that her great-grandfather founded the institution in 1894, that her father chaired it for 19 years, and that nobody removes a Blackwood from Blackwood Meridian. Graham looked at her with something that was almost kindness. "The name on the building is not an exemption," he said. She demanded a vote to remove him as chairman. She said it standing, with her hand flat on the table, and she asked for a second. The room stayed silent. 22 people, 6 of them directors, and not one voice. She looked around at them and called them cowards, and she was, in fairness, not entirely wrong about the previous 9 hours. Then she turned back to me. You think you've won because you found some documents? No. Then what do you imagine you've won? I put the cracked briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside was the Audit Committee's preliminary findings report. 41 pages, and beneath it the minutes of a special session of the board's governance committee held at 7 o'clock that morning, 14 floors below the room we were standing in. Section 11.4 of the Blackwood Meridian Corporate Governance Charter permits the board, upon presentation of credible evidence of an undisclosed conflict of interest by an executive officer in connection with a transaction exceeding $1 billion in value, to suspend that officer's operating authority with immediate effect, by simple majority, without notice period. Her great-grandfather had written that provision. He had written it because he had watched a competitor destroyed from the inside in 1922, and he had wanted his descendants protected from their own executives. Marianne Caldwell read the resolution aloud. Her voice was steady and unhurried, and she did not look up from the page once. Vivienne Blackwood was suspended from the office of Chief Executive, effective immediately, pending completion of the independent investigation. Nobody handcuffed her. No police arrived. There were no raised voices and no security escort waiting theatrically by the elevator. What happened was that a woman in a black jacket stood in a beautiful room on the 52nd floor while 22 people who had been afraid of her for years sat perfectly still and looked at her, and did not stand up, and did not intervene, and did not offer her anything at all. I think that was worse than any arrest would have been. Her executive access credential was deactivated at 9:26, while she was still standing there. And I know the time because Graham's phone showed the confirmation, and he turned it face down out of what I believe was genuine mercy. Elliot Crane was suspended in the same resolution, by the same majority, in under 90 seconds. The dinner she had designed as a celebration of the largest transaction of her career became, without anyone moving to a different room or changing the tablecloth, the meeting that ended her control of her family's company. The orchids were still fresh. The dessert was never served. She turned to me last, and she got there in the end, which I will give her credit for. "So this is the part where you sit in my chair," she said. I closed the briefcase. No. Graham Sterling confirmed it for the room because he knew I would not elaborate. The board had formally offered me the interim chief executive position 11 days earlier, at the same session that created my mandate, with a compensation package I will not repeat because the number is obscene and irrelevant. I had declined it before I ever entered the building. That was the piece Vivienne could not process, and I watched her try. In her model of the world, everything I had done over 9 days was a campaign for a seat, because a seat was the only thing worth 9 days. She could imagine me as vengeful. She could imagine me as ambitious. She had no available category for a man who had gone to that much trouble and did not want the office at the end of it. I agreed to stay 90 days as restructuring advisor. That was all. Not because I am noble, but because there were 9,600 employees, 240 suppliers, and a pension fund in the Northern Division that had nothing to do with whose trust owned what. And somebody had to make certain they did not pay for a decision made in a room they were never invited into. 90 days, a consulting rate that was frankly modest, and no title on any door. Which made the whole afternoon considerably more bitter for her in retrospect, and I imagine she has thought about it since. She had told me to remember that I had a family to feed. She had told me that keeping my mouth shut was how I kept my contract. She had believed, with total confidence, that I needed the work. Blackwood Meridian needed me. I had needed nothing from that building except to get home by 7 for dinner, which I had already missed. Before she left, Vivienne looked at Nora. There was a moment where the old machinery tried to engage, where 20 years of habit reached for a threat, and there was nothing there to reach with. No termination, no reference, no apartment, no industry. I was standing about 4 steps from Nora, and I did not say anything, and I did not move. And Vivian understood the boundary perfectly, because boundaries only require explanation the first time. She walked out. Her heels made the same metronome sound on the marble that they had made that afternoon, slightly too fast, and then the elevator doors closed and the sound stopped. Blackwood Meridian terminated the Alder Peak Logistics acquisition 11 days later, before signing, at a break cost of $9 million. Against exposure that the final independent modeling put at $431 million, that was the least expensive $9 million the company ever spent. The North Vale subordinated debt position was never assumed. The Heritage Trust made nothing. The investigation ran 14 weeks and concluded that Vivian Blackwood had failed to disclose a material personal financial interest in a transaction she originated and pushed toward an expedited vote and had directed the alteration of board materials. She resigned as chief executive before the report was published, which was the last piece of strategy available to her, and, I thought, a reasonably intelligent one. Elliot Crane left the company in the same month. Neither of them went to prison. I have never believed the ending of a story like this requires a cell. What they lost was the thing they had actually been using, the authority, the room that arranged itself around their moods, and the standing that had let them look at people like Nora Whitaker and decide what those people were worth. That is a real loss, and it does not get returned. Nora was offered the position of Director of Executive Operations in the second month. Graham wanted to announce it immediately, framed around the investigation, and I asked him not to. I told him not to make her the girl who got rescued, because that framing would follow her into every room for a decade and would let people credit her career to my dinner. She got the role on the strength of 11 years of work, and because on a night when 6 directors and 11 investors and 4 executives all decided that silence was survivable, a 31-year-old assistant with everything to lose put down a pen twice. I finished on day 90. The Northern pension shortfall was funded. The supplier remittance structure was rebuilt with direct payment, and the audit committee got a permanent independent reporting line that does not pass through the executive floor. Graham offered me a long-term position again on my last afternoon, and the figure was even more absurd than the first one, and I turned it down in the elevator so that neither of us had to sit with it. At 6:12, my phone lit up with a message asking whether I would be home in time for dinner and whether we could have the pasta with the too much cheese. I smiled at the screen in the lobby of a $30 billion company like an idiot. "Dad's on his way," I wrote. I walked out through the revolving doors with the cracked briefcase and no car waiting and nobody applauding. And Nora came through the doors behind me and caught up on the sidewalk. She had a lanyard now with a title on it. She asked me the question she had apparently been holding for 3 months. "Why did you stand up that night? You didn't even know me." I stopped on the sidewalk and thought about how to answer honestly, which took a second. "You don't have to know a person," I said, "to know they don't deserve to be treated that way." She stood outside the building and watched me go until I merged into the crowd on Halsted Street and stopped being distinguishable from anyone else, which is a thing she told me about much later. Here is what I have kept from it. 3 months earlier, every single person in that dining room knew Vivian Blackwood was in the wrong. Not suspected, knew. 6 directors, 11 investors, 4 executives, 22 adults with unobstructed sight lines and functioning consciences. And exactly one of them stood up. Not because I was stronger than she was, because I was not, and she could have ended a dozen careers in that room with 4 phone calls. Not because I was wealthier, because I made less in a year than she spent on cars. Not even, in the end, because I was holding evidence that would finish her, though I was, and though it made standing up almost free. I stood up because power only becomes truly dangerous at the moment when the people watching it get abused decide silence is the safest option. Every threat she made that day rested on that assumption, and it had held for 20 years, right up until one person tested it. She had spent her life believing that money made a room belong to her. What actually happened is that the room belonged to her only for as long as nobody in it was willing to stand. When I looked back from the corner of Halstead, the letters on the glass behind Nora read Blackwood Meridian in the late afternoon light, reversed and gold and perfectly legible. The name is still on the building. It is a good name, and it belongs to 4 generations of people, most of whom earned it. But the woman who believed that name entitled her to reach across a table and take hold of someone's wrist does not sit on the top floor anymore. That is the whole of it, not a punishment. Just a correction, arriving late, delivered quietly, by a man in an 11-year-old suit who only ever wanted to get home for dinner.